Dana Denha here, and this is Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Skilled artists from all over the world come together annually to honor the art of film. They let you into their imagination and creative process through media and performances at the coveted Ann Arbor Film Festival. Artist and filmmaker Cooper Holoweski sheds light on the natural world and its man-made constructs in his films. Welcome, Cooper.
Thank you.
So, Cooper, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, sort of your background, your schooling, what led you to, because your work is sort of different than some of the other filmmakers I've had on here, because I feel like you're creating a lot of your work with your hands and then putting it onto film.
Sure. Well, I went to art school. I actually studied, in undergrad I studied political science and printmaking at the University of Michigan, and then I went to grad school at the Rhode Island School of Design and studied printmaking there.
Looking at your website and stuff, you are creating a lot of sculpture. Do you incorporate that printmaking aspect in your work as well?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I have all this kind of formal education in printmaking, but well, I don't. Yeah, no. I guess like print doesn't directly make its way into film, but I sort of think of like film and video as part of my print practice. I think that. The world of printmaking can sometimes be a bit conservative, and like a print is a lithograph or an etching, and for me, or like a silkscreen or a woodcut. But for me, I mean, what attracted me to printmaking in the first place was the idea of creating multiples and like making media that I can distribute. I mean, at a certain point, I sort of fell in love with like the etched line or the engraved line and things like that, some of the subtleties with it. But really, what brought me to it was the idea of like making something that I can easily share with a lot of people, and so. My view of print, or printmaking, or print media, whatever you want to call it, is actually pretty expansive and includes things like YouTube and Twitter and things like that. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I will say I've taken printmaking classes myself, and there's something very satisfying about making prints and that sort of the whole process of it. Really, I find it to be very satisfying. And then like trying to make everything as uniform as possible when you're actually making the prints. So I'm sure that works well with you creating film now. And what about the political science? Do you find that you're always thinking about the politics when you're creating your message?
No.
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 Yeah.
I think like I mean I got I think a result of like studying political science is like it gave me a well-rounded education, and that like I know how to research things well and dive deep with specific pieces and parts of content that I'm interested in, but. Yeah, I don't consider my work to be particularly political. I mean, I have kind of this esoteric knowledge of international political finance, but I don't actually use it in my work at all. And yeah, but I do think like maybe the research methodologies make their way into it. That's one of the more useful things.
And right now you currently work at Cranbrook. So why don't you tell us about what you do there?
Well, I run the print media department with my colleague Emmy Bright. We are the department heads of the print media department. It's a graduate-only program, so we have 13 students, and yeah, it's essentially like a mentorship program. It's a program that's very catered to each individual student, and so I lead reading groups and critiques and do one-on-one studio visits and bring in visiting artists, and it's a lot of organizing and coordinating and a lot of like one-on-one time with students. For me, that's like the most gratifying part of that job, is the kind of like walking into someone else's studio and deeply sort of empathizing with their concerns, right? Like trying to step out of myself and step into their shoes and think about their work and think about their concerns and help them push their vision as far as possible. It's almost like, I don't know, I get to be a bit of a tourist when I do it, right? Like it's sort of escaping yourself and going into someone else.
Do you ever find that you get inspirations from some of your students?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It absolutely feeds me. And I think teaching at the graduate level, I mean, I love teaching undergrads as well, but it's less about technique and it's less about kind of like, you know, foundational formal concerns, and it's more about content. So I learn a lot about weird things that my students are really interested in, right? Like they're all interested in very different sort of aspects of the world we live in and how to make art in it. And so I learn a lot from them, which is, yeah, it's great.
Well, now that we've learned a little bit about you, why don't we watch one of your films?
I would love that.
Food, Clothing, Shelter uses everyday objects and scenes to trace the development of human consciousness from the fulfillment of our basic needs to early scientific inquiry and the eventual fabrication of our realities through technology. Let's watch. we're back with Cooper Holoweski and his film Food, Clothing, Shelter. So why don't you tell me a little bit about this film and sort of what got you started in making this film about, it's a lot about, like what I said, man-made versus nature, and that sort of seems like a common theme in your subject matter.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a unique. So almost all my work, I think, almost all of my work from the past 10 years operates as a loop. So
yeah,
it's intended. It can be screened at a film fest, but I think in some ways it functions better just being projected in a space, so somebody can walk in and walk out and at any point.
Yeah, I get it. 100%.
Sure.
Yeah.
This, I will say, is a little bit unique, though, in that it's probably the only piece I've made in the past 10 years that has cuts in it. Like, I generally really favor a single shot. So a lot of my work is loops that operate as a single shot and kind of like collapse in on themselves. This piece has two different loops.
I've noticed in looking at some of your other works, you do stop motion. Does this one incorporate stop motion? I couldn't tell.
It does, but in ways that they're kind of like subtle. Like
subtle, yeah. Because I was like sort of like maybe, but I wasn't 100% sure.
A little bit of trickery.
Yeah.
Yeah, what inspired me to make the piece? Well, I was thinking about the idea of, I guess the idea of being a spirit in the world, being a sort of like consciousness in the world and sort of navigating that, and then the development from existing in the world to sort of like having a desire to understand the world, and then a desire to sort of fabricate the world or refabricate the world, and the piece really traces that, right? So it starts with just like an image of, there's like these kind of cycles that go through that are light, stone, forest, light, stone, sky, and forest, right? And it goes through these cycles, and it starts in a very kind of like naturalistic setting. It's like it's literally in the forest.
Yeah.
It's literally like looking at the sky as a time lapse of the sky, of the stars, and then things get sort of slowly fabricated. So there's that cycle of like, light always stays light, but then rock becomes like concrete, a sort of concrete texture, and sky becomes like a corrugated roof, and the forest becomes like plywood, and then it sort of like evolves into these kind of more creature comfort spaces, to the point where our basic human physiological needs are covered, right? We get to the point where we're quite comfortable with food, clothing, and shelter, which allows consciousness to sort of expand into scientific inquiry and like looking into. Then there's this point in the film where there's like objects of inquiry, right? There's a geode, there's this hematite and piece of steel, there's a coral, and then we get into kind of like it's not just a rock, but it's a rock next to the drawing of a rock. So it's like looking at reality and kind of depicting it, and then the piece concludes with a 3D model of a rock in a forest, and then kind of looking back up in the sky and kind of collapses back on itself in that way.
Do you see this as like, this is, obviously these are the needs of human beings, food, shelter, clothing, but do you see it as like, maybe we ask for too much from the natural world as well? Like we're taking a lot from it, or?
I don't know. I don't know if I'm that editorial about it. But I am like curious about like, where does consciousness lead us, right? Like what's the end game? And it feels like, in my mind, maybe it's overly romantic, but I think things become sort of very cyclical in that sense, right? Like we're sort of like lost in nature, we're lost in the world, and then we get to a point where we can like fabricate our own world, and our own world looks a lot like the world we were originally lost in, and so then we're lost in the world that we fabricated. Like I like that idea of the kind of snake eating its own tail.
And that sort of works with how you put yourself on a loop too.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's part of the reason I really favor that form. Yeah, absolutely.
So we've heard a little bit about this film, but we're actually going to watch another one of your films right now. As Above, So Below is a 2D channel HD video that uses everyday objects to depict parallels between the atomic and subatomic realms. Let's watch. We're back with Cooper, and we just watched his film, As Above, So Below. This piece was actually in the Ann Arbor Film Festival last year.
It was, yep.
So why don't you talk about sort of being a part of the Ann Arbor Film Festival, and did you go? Were you able to go and watch?
I did, yeah.
So how was it to sort of watch this movie in the theater during the Ann Arbor Film Festival?
It was quite a joy. It was quite a treat.
Yeah. Have you seen your films in theaters like that before? Or is this...
No, I mean, again, I typically show work in like a gallery space. This piece, the first time this piece was shown was actually at D-Electricity, which is like a big outdoor electronic arts festival in Detroit. So a couple of years ago, it was projected on the side of the DIA, which is another kind
that's
of like...
sweet.
Yeah, it was amazing. And it had also like amazing sound system, but like being outdoors and going on this continuous loop is a very different experience than being indoors and having, you know, you're not dealing with ambient light. So all the subtleties of the piece are shown, and the sound is also really prominent. And it's a
very like futuristic. It sort of takes you into the future, the sound of this whole thing. But why don't you talk about that? Because it is sort of like you're going into outer space, and like in your last film, I think we saw some outer space in there too. But why don't you talk about sort of what your thought process was for this? Because this is a loop too. This is a longer loop, but you see a little bit more. And I'd like you to also mention how you're like creating sculpture to make film.
I'm happy to. That would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I should start by saying like there are a couple things I was thinking about with this film. One was that it's kind of referencing the Eames film, Powers of 10, Ray and Charles Eames film from 1979. They were commissioned by the IBM Corporation to make a short film that essentially every 10 seconds zoomed out 10 times, right? So it starts with a couple lounging on Soldiers Field in Chicago, and it zooms out as, you know, you see Illinois, you see the Midwest, you see the Earth, you see the solar system, you see, you know, it just kind of keeps going until you see like the Milky Way, and then it zooms back in, and then it does the opposite. It goes into the skin of one of the people laying on the field, and keeps going into a kind of a subatomic level. So that was like one point of inspiration. The other thing that I was thinking about was there's this kind of esoteric theologian from the 17th century, this guy Robert Flood, who I think about in a lot of my work, and he was the person who coined the terms macrocosm and microcosm, and he essentially created this whole system. He thought that the human form was this fulcrum for how the universe worked. So he was a physician, and he was someone who, like, if you came to him with like a blood disease, he would look to the stars to see, to diagnose you, which is kind of not very good medicine, right? Like he ended up losing his license as a doctor, but there's a really like romantic thing about that I latched onto.
Well, obviously it stuck with you.
Clearly, yeah. So I like the idea. You know, certainly think about the idea of like electrons spinning in a electrons spinning in the parallel between that and the planets in the solar system, which you see in the film. I also was really interested in the limits of human knowledge, right? Like with the Charles and Ray Eames film, they went to the sort of extreme end of like what science had at their disposal. They also had all of the resources of IBM, so they had electron microscopes and things like that. I didn't have that. I had cardboard and duct tape. And I kind of like the idea that the farther we get from understanding, the mediums change, right? It starts with very clear video, and then it turns into computer 3D modeling, and then it transforms into like very crude hand models, or not crude at first, but they get increasingly crude.
They do get cruder as they go along.
Yeah, to the point where you can see like, oh, that's cardboard and that's duct tape. And I think with a lot of my work, I like really using accessible materials, and I like those materials to assert themselves in a way that I think one of my goals is that I like to have my viewers have moments of transcendence, and then also be like, oh wait, that's duct tape.
Yeah.
And then kind of like oscillate between those feelings of transcendence and like, oh, that's just like cellophane. That's like a...
Well, as I mentioned to you during the film, at first I could not tell that you had glued marbles together, but as the film had gone on, I realized it. But at first I could not tell at all. I actually, at the very beginning, I think I was sort of thought you made it in a computer program. And then as I watched it, I'm like, no way, that couldn't be. But we're actually out of time. But it was great talking to you.
Yeah,
and thank you
well.
for sharing your films with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. This is a real treat.
To watch this and other CTN series, visit youtube.com/CTN Ann Arbor. And remember to like, comment, and share. I'm Dana Denhoff for Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival.